Today I'm joined by Dr. John Cook. Dr. Cook is a Senior Research Fellow with the Melbourne Centre of Behaviour Change at the University of Melbourne. He obtained his PhD at the University of Western Australia studying the cognitive psychology of climate science denial. His research focuses on understanding and countering misinformation about climate change. In 2007, he founded Skeptical Science, a website which won the 2011 Australian Museum Eureka Prize for the advancement of climate change knowledge, and 2016 Friend of the Planet Award from the National Centre for Science Education. John authored the book Cranky Uncle vs. Climate Change, which combines climate science, critical thinking, and cartoons to explain countering climate misinformation. He also has co-authored college textbook Climate Change, Examining the Facts and Climate Change Science, A Modern Synthesis, and the book Climate Change Denial, Heads in the Sand. In 2013, he published a paper finding 97% scientific consensus on human-caused global warming, a finding that has been highlighted by President Barack Obama and UK Prime Minister David Cameron. Thank you for joining me, John.
Thanks, Xavier. I need to make my bio a bit briefer, I think. It's getting too long.
No, I think it's a good point. I think it's good if you have a long bio. It tells people that you've been on a long journey and you've done a lot of interesting things. And it's something that I was actually quite pleasantly happy to find out about your background. So to start with, I think it's worthwhile to zoom out and establish why we research information. I think in the recent decade or so, everyone's become familiar with the term misinformation and disinformation, but why do we study disinformation? Why is it something that we need to have expertise in?
Yeah, it's a good question. We, in fact, published the paper on that very question just over the last week. Myself and some of my colleagues. Ulrich Ecker was the lead author. And the paper's called Why We Can't Ignore Misinformation. And it explains really that question, why do we need to study it? And the main answer is because misinformation does damage. There's a lot of research into the effects of misinformation, and it does damage to society in a number of different ways. And if we don't study it, understand it, and counter it, then it will continue to do all those different kinds of damage.
Absolutely. And, I think like any good scientist or armchair philosopher, I think, in my case, I think it would be good to establish the definition of misinformation and disinformation. And so obviously these are terms that have become common parlance and people use them a lot, but I think there's potential error for misuse of those terms. So just to start off with, can you help us understand and define those two terms? Like, what is misinformation? What is disinformation? What is the difference between them?
Well, I'll give you the simple answer and then I'll give you a more nuanced answer. So the simple answer is misinformation is false information, while disinformation is a subset of that. It's false information that is intentionally created to deceive people. So disinformation is deliberately deceptive and misinformation is wrong, but it might be intentional, people might genuinely believe it. Motive is not really specified when it comes to misinformation. So that's kind of the loosey-goosey definition. But from my point of view, I find having a more precise definition is useful in terms of actually countering misinformation. And the most common definition for misinformation is arguments that conflict with the best available evidence or experts, which is often a good definition when it comes to scientific misinformation, but it doesn't always cover everything. There are certain types of misinformation that are difficult to fact check because they more ambiguous or more subtle. And so I find my practical definition for misinformation is arguments that are misleading. In other words, that contain misleading rhetorical techniques or logical fallacies.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point. And if I'm understanding you correctly, disinformation, that more intentional form of lying, is something that I think people may conflate with the term misinformation, with is just sort of general error in terms of understanding. And they may be used interchangeably, but it should be noted that there is a clear distinction between the two terms.
Yeah, understanding the difference between misinformation and disinformation, it's important to distinguish between deliberate deception and just false information. But also, there's a trickiness there because coming back to the definition I like, misleading fallacies, let me give you an example of that. One misleading fallacy is cherry picking, which is often using truthful statements to cast a misleading impression. For example, a fossil fuel company will say, we spent $10 million on solar power projects, so we are good for the environment. We're being responsible environmental citizens. And while that is a true statement that they've spent $10 million on solar power, they're failing to disclose the fact that they've spent 99% of their budget on fossil fuel activities that are destructive for the environment. So they make a true statement, but it gives a misleading impression. And so arguments like cherry picking are difficult to fact check because they can often be true statements. So that's why explaining techniques of misinformation is often a handy way of identifying if someone's trying to mislead you or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we'll definitely get into the types of misinformation and the purveyors of misinformation, all those juicy details, as I would say. But just to start off with, we recently interviewed a climate communicator called Genevieve Gunther, and she's written an excellent book on how language is used in a intentionally misleading manner to convey different meanings of terms which are used in common parlance. So, for example, the word theory in common parlance means something very different to what theory means in a scientific domain. And in her book, she talks about climate change denial and how it's evolved over time. And I'd be curious from your perspective as an expert in climate change misinformation, how have you seen climate change denial, even science denial for that matter, how have you seen that evolve over the past few decades?
Yeah, we published a paper in Scientific Reports back in 2021 where we looked at the last 20 years of climate misinformation, and we trained a machine learning model to detect all the different types of claims, and then we just poured hundreds of thousands of articles into our model to construct this 2-decade history of climate misinformation. What we found was climate misinformation has steadily been transitioning from science denial to solutions misinformation. So less denying the science of climate change, although they're still doing that, but more and more they're increasingly focusing on attacking climate solutions, attacking climate policy, and attacking renewable energy.
And why are they doing that?
Well, I would guess that the main reason is because science denial is becoming more and more untenable as the science becomes more undeniable. So it's like a strategic retreat to a more plausible misinformation.
A shifting of the goalpost, to use a more logical fallacy-based term. And you use the term "they," and I know that in conspiracy circles, for example, "they" is used very often because it is an easy way to sort of do a lot of heavy lifting without being specific. But I believe you're talking about something quite different here. So when you refer to "they," the sources of misinformation, can you tell us about who are the sources of misinformation? Who is "they" in this context?
Yeah, it's very, very precisely defined in our 2021 paper. We were looking specifically at two sources: conservative think tank websites and climate denial blogs. And the reason why we chose those two were they were very prolific sources of climate misinformation, and also very easily scraped from the internet. So they were the low-hanging fruit of climate misinformation.
In terms of misinformation, I mean, I think one of your co-authors of your papers, a colleague of yours named Naomi Oreskes, who is quite a prolific writer and a science communicator, and her book Merchants of Doubt is seen as a classic in the climate change space. Anyways, but she talks about big tobacco in her book and those sorts of industries that have used similar disinformation campaigns to undermine the public's trust in science, or to deny the inevitability of banning or at least increasing taxes on tobacco and things of that sort. So can you tell us about how climate change is, as a political issue or as an issue period, is something that is not unique in the sense that we will see similar tactics of disinformation, delay, and denial well into the future for other issues, and how it's not just something that is reserved for climate change?
Yeah, speaking of Naomi Oreskes, in 2014 I went to a conference in San Francisco, the American Geophysical Union fall meeting. They have it every December. And actually my PhD supervisor at the time, Stefan Lewandowski, he was saying he was going to have drinks with Naomi that evening. So I said, oh, can I tag along? And I got to spend an hour just chatting with Naomi over a beer in front of a fireplace, which was very cool. And she was telling me about all the work she was doing at the time, a lot of it involving doing expert testimony in trials. And she was describing how she was documenting and being an expert witness on misinformation across a whole range of industries, not just the fossil fuel companies, but other companies, chemical companies, or I don't know, any company, any industry that was producing misinformation, and it seemed to be all of them. And it really blew me away how, like, I have this very tunnel vision focus on climate misinformation, but she was working in tobacco misinformation and a whole range of other industries. And it just really broadened my horizon on just how misinformation is across so many other topics as well.
If anyone's interested in this sort of media on this front in a movie form, I would highly recommend watching a movie called Dark Waters, starring Mark Ruffalo, who traces the story of forever chemicals and their origin, and how, similarly to climate change, the evidence of and impacts of forever chemicals on people was buried by companies like DuPont and 3M. But yeah, anyway, so that's sort of a side tangent, but a very good movie, I must say. But now, returning to misinformation, your field is in cognitive psychology, and we've interviewed two professors of cognitive psychology before, but I think it's a very interesting field and something that should be studied. But can you tell us in brief how cognitive psychology directly relates to climate change, misinformation, or climate science?
So cognitive psychology looks at individual psychology. So how do individuals respond to different messages, whether the message is misinformation or debunking of misinformation or pre-bunking, or we basically run experiments where we test different messages in order to work out what are the impacts of misinformation on different types of people, and then what are the most effective ways of countering it. So it's really building an evidence base for coming up with strategies to push back against misinformation.
Can you give us an example of something that cognitive psychology, or even perhaps one of your studies that you've run, how this translates to how we understand people?
Yeah, so in 2017, one of my first papers I published was testing the impact of climate misinformation on the public. So I ran an experiment where I divided people up into two groups. One group was shown just misinformation, and another group was randomly, like two random groups. And the other group were shown a pre-bunking priming message and then misinformation. So let me talk about the misinformation only group first to explain what our research found. The climate misinformation we showed them was an excerpt from a website called the Global Warming Petition Project. So this is a website that lists 31,000 American scientists who have signed a statement saying humans are not disrupting climate. And the basic gist of this website is to say there's no scientific consensus on climate change because, hey, look, 31,000 scientists. So we showed them an excerpt of this misinformation and then tested their climate attitudes, beliefs, to see what impact the misinformation had. And the key result we found was that the misinformation had a disproportionate effect on people who were politically conservative. It had almost no effect on people on the other end of the political spectrum, people at the left end of the political spectrum. It only really affected political conservatives. And so what this told us was that misinformation is polarizing. When misinformation washes over the public, it doesn't affect everyone the same way, and people's opinions about climate change split apart, get further apart, and the public become more polarized.
Do you have a sense of why it impacted conservative? So it's people that have conservative political inclinations. That may mean, is that what we mean by conservative?
Yeah, politically conservative. So people who believe in small government, in deregulation, and they think that the market should dictate how we run society rather than government regulation.
So in short, misinformation doesn't have a uniform effect on a population. So if we were to run this in another country, people that have the same sort of, or people that have similar political leanings would be disproportionately impacted. That's at least something that we can infer from this research.
Yes, but to a lesser degree. So not my study, but another study actually from a Queensland researcher, Matthew Hornsey, at the University of Queensland. He did a study of basically looking at all these different studies across many different countries to see whether that polarization was the same in other countries, and they found that it wasn't. Certain countries were more polarized than others. First was the USA; they were the most polarized country. Second was Australia, and daylight third. So Australia and the US were way above every other country. Right. And so what this tells us, and again, this is another interesting insight from psychological research, is that climate polarization isn't hardwired into the human brain. It doesn't have to be that way. It's not that way across all countries. And even in the US, it wasn't always as polarized. It's become polarized, and misinformation has contributed to that.
And I think this point relates to some of your other research as well that I've read about regarding the drivers of climate misinformation belief. And so, what are the drivers of climate change misinformation aside from political ideology? If I'm not mistaken, is one of those factors. What are some other drivers that dictate who believes in misinformation?
The best study to answer that question again comes from Matthew Hornsey. He did what us scientist nerds would call a meta-analysis, or really a survey of surveys. He collected all the different surveys on climate attitudes to work out what were the main drivers. Political ideology was the second biggest driver. The biggest driver was political affiliation. And they sound like the same thing, right? Political affiliation and political ideology, but there is certainly a lot of overlap between the two, but they are subtly different. Political affiliation is what tribe you belong to, right, and political ideology are your beliefs. Now, if you belong to the tribe of political conservatives, if you're in Australia a Liberal or a National Party voter, or in the US a Republican, your political beliefs will also be conservative. They overlap a lot. But tribalism goes a lot deeper. It's a much more primal driver than our beliefs.
And so if I understand you correctly, would an example of this, drawing on the United States as an example, would an example of this be institutionalism? So people that believe in institutions versus people that believe in the opposite to that. So people that are, down with the system.
Yeah, I think that the anti-elitism that you find in political conservatism at the moment. And again, it's not necessarily hardwired, but that's where society is right now. I think that's more a symptom than a driver. There is and I think it probably goes in both directions. It's this sort of reinforcing feedback, because when institutions such as climate scientists and scientific institutions like NASA and NOAA and the IPCC are telling us that climate change is real, and then people respond to that by attacking the institutions and attacking scientists in order to discredit the findings of science, then that breeds this anti-elitism. So it's a complex reinforcing feedback.
Cycle.
Yeah, indeed.
Well, I think that it covers a lot of the fundamentals on climate change misinformation. Now, what I would be interested in focusing on now is actually the types of misinformation that we see. So I think a lot of people will be familiar with misinformation. You can see it pretty much everywhere now. And you can go on, prominent spaces on YouTube. So, for example, if you go to Murdoch type news, so Fox News, Sky News, for example, and you type in climate change, Fox News, you'll see plenty of examples of people believing in or spouting climate change misinformation. And so, are there particular types of misinformation? And is there particular types that are more potent to us in the sense of what impacts us most in terms of our beliefs or our belief in science?
Yes, and we've touched on it, I think, already. So, in fact, I had an honours student run an experiment trying to answer that question, and we're in the process of writing it up. But I'll give you a spoiler alert on what we found. We found that the most potent, damaging forms of climate misinformation were either attacking climate science or scientists, or attacking solutions. So it wasn't so much the science arguments about whether global warming is real or caused by humans. It was more, can't trust scientists, can't trust climate science or climate models, you can't trust climate solutions, you can't trust renewables. So it was more about attacking those. But again, the misinformation had the biggest effect amongst political conservatives. So that's where it was most effective.
Yeah, and I think we skimmed over this, but I think it's worth focusing on on it for a bit. What is it specifically about politically conservative people that makes it such that they are more impacted as opposed to someone that is left of center or someone that is a part of another political affiliation?
Yeah, it's a really important question and important to understand. The answer is, the technical term is solutions aversion. In other words, people don't like the solutions to climate change, so they deny that there's a problem in the first place that needs solving. And there was a study, I'm blanking on the authors' names right now, which will probably annoy them, so I apologize in advance. But they ran an experiment where they divided people up into two groups, and both groups were shown some climate science information, identical, but then the two groups were shown different solutions. One solution was nuclear power as a solution to climate change, and the other was regulating the fossil fuel industry. They found that conservatives responded positively to the nuclear power message, and they were more accepting of climate science, but they rejected the climate science when the solution was regulating the fossil fuel industry. In other words, they don't like the solution of regulation. And that goes back to the original question, what do I mean by political conservatism? It's about anti-regulation and small governments. So if the solution to climate change is regulation, they don't like regulation, therefore they deny that there's a problem that needs regulating.
And I think, just a quick observation, I think a lot of the findings of psychology, whether it's cognitive psychology, social psychology, it is pretty fascinating because you can keep digging down into each finding. So, for example, what is the most potent type of misinformation? Okay, who is it most potent to? Okay, political conservatives. Okay, why is it more potent to them? It's because conservatives are more solutions averse. And, you can keep digging and digging, but ultimately the question arrives at, why are political conservatives more averse to this type of thing? And my reading of behavioral science, so for example, there's a great academic called Robert Sapolsky, who's a neuroendocrinologist from Stanford University, and he goes into the biological roots of religion and all sorts of things, and he goes into personality differences, for example, and I believe in his book he talks about how some personality differences, even of conservatives versus liberals on the left-leaning sense, there's a genetic component to this, some sort of genetic behavioral component, and this arrives at a slightly philosophical point on determinism versus free will. How much free will do we actually have to choose? How much free will do we have in determining our beliefs?
Yeah, what you're talking about sounds like we're getting close to the nature versus nurture question. And later on, we're going to talk about fallacies. I worry that trying to go down that road is close to the danger of false dichotomy. I think that often both factors are involved, nature and nurture. So certainly our surroundings and our upbringing and our experiences, and especially our social groups, have a strong influence on our beliefs. So I haven't particularly studied whether one is more powerful than the other, but I would, if I was a betting man, I would imagine that nurture was more of a powerful driving factor than nature. In other words, not genetic or intrinsic as much as just our environment, and particularly our social environment.
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting point to bring up, and I'm tempted to go down the philosophical route in terms of free will and whatnot.
Well, just to digress on that, like I remember vividly having a conversation with my PhD supervisor, Lewandowski, and I can't remember how we got onto this, but we were talking about free will, and he was basically saying he didn't think that people did have free will, not for theological reasons, but for deterministic, like biological reasons, that our brains are hardwired and we follow the physical hardwiring of our brains. And at the time it really shocked me, but the more I think about it, we are getting very metaphysical now, so I'm not sure, but it's
not the metaphysics.
Even if you don't want to get too much into the philosophy, I think that even in just basic psychology, there's slow thinking and fast thinking. There's system 1 thinking and system 2 thinking, where slow thinking is where we just slow down and critically think through difficult problems, and fast thinking is just our immediate gut reaction. And I think that gut reaction is that more deterministic kind of way of responding to things, and that is definitely the bulk of our reaction in our psychology is fast thinking.
Well, if anyone's listening and is interested in more of the philosophy side of this argument, the free will versus determinism type of argument, I recommend Robert Sapolsky's book, Behave, which he argues in the case of determinism is the only way to live, essentially. And I think he brings up some pretty interesting points. But anyways, let's stay within the realm of cognitive psychology. I wanted to touch on a quick point on purveyors of misinformation. So I know, based on Naomi Oreskes' book, there are institutions that have funded and have been sources of misinformation. So people like the Koch brothers have funded various misinformation campaigns. You also have blogs, as you've mentioned in your recent studies, and how blogs can be just as effective in carrying out misinformation, whether that's through ad hominem attacks, which are attacks on character as opposed to arguments based on reasoning. But something that I wanted to touch on is that I think, and this includes myself, I've fallen into traps set by really skilled rhetoricians. So people that are very good at speaking, people that are very good at communicating and presenting themselves as authorities. So someone that comes to mind, for example, is Jordan Peterson, who, for example, will go on Joe Rogan's podcast and with a lot of conviction and verbal speed and authority, speak on a number of spout a number of facts and a number of claims against climate change. I shouldn't say facts, I should say claims, because they're not factual. But they'll do it with such great authority that it makes you believe these people are telling the truth. And I say this because I think a lot of people don't know much about climate science will be convinced by these arguments and by this rhetoric. And I would levy that this would have a very big influence on people ending up being on the fence of climate change or even not believing in climate change. Can you comment on the sophistication of these purveyors of misinformation? Is this something that, if people feel duped by, that actually it's something that would make sense given that they are so skilled in communicating in this way?
Yeah, conviction and confidence does a lot of heavy lifting in terms of persuading people. So someone who can rattle off a lot of arguments and claims in quick fashion with confidence comes across as very convincing to a casually listening audience. So someone like Jordan Peterson can be quite persuasive to an audience if they don't know how to spot the fallacies. And fallacies are persuasive because they kind of hide the deceptiveness in them. And if you don't know how to spot them, then you are vulnerable to being misled.
Yeah, and I think this is a good place to go into the strategies against misinformation, to counter misinformation. And I know that you've written a lot about this, and you have a whole taxonomy of some sort, a toolkit, I would say, on how to counter misinformation. So can you start us off with some basic terms and strategies, maybe how to think about these strategies? Is there some sort of theory we can use to ground ourselves and then move upwards from there?
Yeah, I stumbled into the main approach I use now when I published that study back in 2017 that I mentioned earlier, where I was trying to counter that misinformation from the global warming petition project, the list of 31,000 scientists, dissenting scientists. And so in that study, I was trying to how can you warn people about this so that if they encounter that misinformation, they're not going to be misled? Can you preemptively warn people? And so what I ended up doing was I warned them of the technique that the misinformation used to mislead people, which in the case of the petition project is the technique of fake experts, using people who convey the impression of expertise but don't have the relevant expertise. With the petition project, it's 31,000 scientists, but it's scientists in any field of science. So you've got computer scientists and veterinary scientists, medical scientists, but less than 1% of the 31,000 actually have any expertise in climate science. And so without even mentioning the petition project at all, we just said, look out for the technique of fake experts, which is a form of misinformation. And then I used tobacco misinformation, like what Naomi Oreskes has studied, as an example of the fake expert strategy. They had a strategy back in the 20th century, mid 20th century, like back in the sort of Mad Men 50s era. They called it the White Coat Project, where they just had dudes, always dudes, in white coats, saying smoking soothes the throat, smoking is not harmful, and that was their way of persuading people using fake experts. What we found was once you explain the technique of fake experts, then you showed them misinformation using that technique, like the Global Warming Petition Project, then it was no longer effective. And importantly, it was ineffective or neutralized across the political spectrum. So even for political conservatives who were disproportionately persuaded by the misinformation, once they learnt that they were being tricked by this technique, the trick no longer worked on them.
So, in summary, pre-bunking, or in this case, training people to identify how they're being duped is extremely effective across all populations that you observed in your study, including the people that are disproportionately affected by misinformation.
Yeah, very carefully worded. That you should write conclusions to scientific papers because it was quite well qualified. Yes, and so yeah, it is pre-bunking, but it's a specific type of pre-bunking or inoculation, which is, we call it technique-based inoculation or logic-based inoculation, because you're explaining the misleading techniques, you're warning them about them, or the misleading logical fallacies.
And I suppose inoculation is borrowed from the medical field in the way that you would inoculate someone against a medical ailment in order to help them be able to deal with the effects better. In this case, you're inoculating people by providing them with the skills to think through tricky logical problems.
Yeah, pretty much. And I didn't even realize that what I was doing was inoculation at the time. It wasn't until afterwards, when I was presenting my research I think it was at University of New South Wales, actually, at a psychology conference, and I was explaining this, warning people about fake expert strategy, and one of the professors in the room said, "That sounds a lot like inoculation theory," and I was like, "What now?" And so I went and Googled it and realized that inoculation theory had been around since the 1960s. So someone much smarter than me had already thought of this 50 years ago. And so the idea of inoculation theory, it borrows the idea of vaccination, but what we do is we expose people to a weakened version of misinformation, and that builds up their immunity so that they're less likely to be misled by actual misinformation.
Well, I'm curious now, John, before you came across claims or fallacies on climate science, were you ever duped or were you caught off guard and been like, I don't know, that actually sounds quite convincing. What is your story in terms of being introduced to these fallacies, and whether any fallacies that were effective on you before you became a pre-bunking, critical thinking aficionado?
So I mentioned that technique-based inoculation was one form of pre-bunking. The other form is fact-based inoculation, where you explain how misinformation is wrong through factual explanations. If you understand the facts, the science, deeply enough, then when you see attempts to distort that science, you can see that it's wrong. And up till the point where I was starting my psychology PhD, I would say that I was doing the fact-based approach. I was learning how climate science worked, and I was taking misinformation claims and comparing them to what the peer-reviewed climate science was saying. And both are important. The fact-based approach is important. The technique-based approach is also important. And I don't think they're competing approaches, they're complementary approaches.
Yeah, and I think what I was hinting at that question, and something that's I've drawn on from my personal experience, is that people that are really smart, or people that at least I perceive to be really smart, can fall for logical fallacies. And I won't go into any details, but there was an example at my recent university where I got into a conversation with a professor who didn't believe in climate change, and this caught me off guard, because I know that this person is very, very smart, or like I said, perceived to be smart, I should say, and someone that was very well educated. They had a PhD and whatnot. And one of the arguments that he made is that, look, if climate change is so serious, then why aren't we doing anything about it in a way that, and by that he meant, why isn't everyone in belief of climate change? Because it threatens their very existence. If it was that serious, and it is as serious as the science is, then it wouldn't make any sense for people to not believe in it.
May I ask what field this expert is in?
I'll tell you later.
Okay. I mean, there are a lot of examples in human history of people acting against their own self-interest. But I think the simple answer to that is misinformation. People are ignoring climate change because they've been misinformed. And there's more, it's more complicated than that when we've gone into a lot of the psychology and the political affiliation / political ideology reasons. But that's really argument. That's the bandwagon fallacy, basically. Saying if everyone isn't really concerned about it, then it mustn't be real.
And look, we'll leave some more examples for later on because I'd like to demonstrate the use of these strategies, so technique-based strategies and fact-based strategies to showcase, do it like a mini boot camp on how to think about misinformation, how to counter misinformation. But look, going back to strategies, in summary, there are 2 strategies that you've found in your research to be the most effective based on the empirical work that you've done. So there are technique-based strategies, and by technique we mean philosophical, logical fallacies. So using, if I'm not just wrong, logic, using formal logic to deduce whether something is in fact right or wrong. So that's the first technique. Is that right?
Mostly, it's formal logic is part of that, and logical fallacies is part of that. But the reason, and I used to call it logic-based inoculation, but I've lately switched more to calling it technique-based, because part of it is logical fallacies, but part of it is also just rhetorical techniques like impersonation or trolling, so they're not necessarily formal logic arguments, but they are techniques that are used to manipulate.
So an example of this, one that I can think of, is someone being incredulous about being asked something that is, whether it's real or not. So a very strong emotive reaction, and the inference of this is that, how can you believe this? That sort of technique is a technique as opposed to a logical fallacy. Is that right?
That's kind of argument from incredulity, which I guess could be a fallacy as well. So once you start talking about fallacies, because informal fallacies are a bit fuzzy, it is hard to put it into neat boxes sometimes. But so again, that's why I tend to speak slightly more generally about rhetorical techniques.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Good. So that's the first one, technique-based strategies, and then the second strategy which you found to work is fact-based strategy, which is evaluating a claim on its truth value. So, is it hot today? Well, you can measure the temperature, and it's a yes or no answer. And these are the 2 techniques that you've arrived at, and you have a taxonomy. I think it's called F.L.I.C.C. F.L.I.C.C. Is that right?
Exactly. I was giving a talk to the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. So it's all young people, and I was asked to talk about climate misinformation, and I wanted to give them a way to easily remember the different techniques in misinformation. And there was a paper published by Pascal Diethelm that listed the 5 traits of science denial. And so I thought, can I turn these 5 traits into a catchy, easy to remember acronym? And so I started going through them. There was fake experts, unrealistic expectations, cherry picking. I thought, I'm going in a bad direction here. So when you're trying to come up with an acronym, I juggled them around and ended up going with fake experts, logical fallacies, impossible expectations, cherry picking, and conspiracy theories. F.L.I.C.C.
Great. So, look, let's try and go through each one of these. So, the first letter in F.L.I.C.C, F, this stands for fake experts. And so, this is one that you've brought up before. So, this was the claim made by people that there's a petition of 30,000 scientists going around saying that climate change isn't occurring, or, whatever the claim was. And this is an example of the logical fallacy, or the technique-based fallacy, I should say, where you're deferring to experts that do not have true expertise in the area that they're claiming authority on. So, for example, if you have, let's say your dog is sick, you don't just take your dog to a physicist because the physicist is a scientist. You take your dog to a vet because that's who has the authority, the expert authority in that matter. So that's F. That's the first letter in the F.L.I.C.C acronym. Okay, moving on to the next letter, L, which stands for logical fallacies. So I think an example of a logical fallacy is the one that I gave in the example previously about the professor that I spoke with who said, well, if climate change is real, then it should be the case that everyone believes in it because, it would be commensurate to the action needed, right? We need people, if something is that serious, people would respond. But this is an example of the bandwagon fallacy. And there's, many different types of logical fallacies. So this is one of many logical fallacies. Can you perhaps list some of the common logical fallacies that you see?
Yeah, the most common logical fallacy in climate misinformation is probably single cause. Ad hominem would be the most common,
Yep.
which is attacking scientists. But and so ad hominem it's Latin for to the person. It's about attacking the person rather than addressing their arguments. And that's actually one of the most common forms of climate misinformation.
Yeah, and so I think an example of this, you mentioned that attacking science or attacking scientists, I should say, is one of the most potent forms of misinformation. And so, let's say, to use an example, in 2013, you wrote a paper that said 97% of climate scientists agree that climate change is occurring. Or, what was the conclusion of that paper?
Well, sorry. No, it was 97% of climate scientists agree that humans are causing global warming.
Yeah, great. Yeah, good. Okay, so an example of an ad hominem attack would be, well, John Cook is so-and-so, so why would we believe him, right?
And that was exactly what they did.
Yeah, okay, good.
Hundreds of articles filled with ad hominem attacks against me.
Yeah, and yet, nevertheless, can I just say that your paper was tweeted by President Barack Obama, which I think is a pretty cool accolade to have.
That was the reason why there was hundreds of attacks.
Okay.
Because if he hadn't tweeted about our paper, which happened the day after our paper was published, it would have just been another scientific paper that people might not have even noticed.
Right.
But because it got so much attention, then the attacks came trying to cast doubt on it.
Yeah, and I mean, perhaps this is a more like a clinical psych question, but do you have a sense of why the attacks themselves, we perceive them as having more sort of weight to them? Like, why is a personal attack an influential type of fallacy?
I have a hunch on why that's so, and I've been meaning to trying to figure out an experiment to kind of delve into it. But I'll give you my hunch. Humans are social animals, and attacks are a social form of misinformation. And some of the most common climate misinformation arguments are social. The Global Warming Petition Project is a social argument. Fake expert strategy is social because it's here are people who are saying this and they seem like experts, so you should listen to them. And so ad hominem is also a social argument. And so my hunch is that social arguments work best because humans are social animals, but I don't quite know how I could prove that hypothesis in an experiment.
Yeah, well, look, I'm sure you'll come up with some sort of ingenious way to measure that, because I think it's a question that I know people would be very interested to know. But yeah, speaking from past conversations, we've interviewed the director of the Climate Change Risk Center, I forget its name, at UNSW, Professor Ben Newell, and we also spoke with the behavioural economist from University of Queensland, Leonel Page, and they both argue very similarly on those sorts of questions that humans are a social species. We're an animal at the end of the day that's evolved through natural selection to survive, as opposed to be a truth-seeking entities. And so and the way we have survived is by living in groups, and so we're very sensitive and acutely predisposed to react to things, and especially things that impinge on the way that we act in groups. And so I think that that's a hunch that is shared by would be shared by your colleagues. Okay, so we've covered F, fake experts, L, logical fallacies, and now we're on I in the F.L.I.C.C acronym. What does I stand for?
I is impossible expectations, which is demanding levels of proof or levels of scientific certainty that science is unable to deliver. And therefore, if you, for example, saying, you need to tell me exactly when and how and to what degree climate change is going to affect this specific thing. And if you can't, then you don't know anything. Or the simple version of that is, if you don't know everything, then you know nothing.
Okay, cool. So, I think we can think of examples in our personal life about how this fallacy manifests. But in the specific context of climate change, is there a particular example that you know of at the top of your head for impossible expectations?
I'd say the one that we're probably going to see more and more actually appears in solutions misinformation. So it's not just impossible expectations of what science can deliver, it's also impossible expectations of what climate solutions can deliver. And so the argument is to look at a specific climate policy and say, well, this policy is only going to reduce global warming by 0.00001 degrees, so what's the point? We might as well not do it. And it's an impossible expectation because it's not a single policy that solves climate change. It's all the different climate policies across the world added up together that will solve it.
And I think an example I'm thinking of with respect to impossible expectations is to do with electric vehicles. And so, let me know if this is in line with the acronym or, the idea of the acronym. So I've seen, with regards to debate on electric vehicle policy, those that are in opposition to electric vehicles, or one of the arguments I've heard is that they'll say that, the mineral extraction involved for to construct a battery for electric vehicles is exorbitantly higher than the mineral extraction used for normal combustion vehicles. And on top of that, the environmental impacts of extracting these minerals, so for, let's say, lithium, is very impactful on environments. And so for this reason, if you are an environmentalist, you ought not to adopt these vehicles because you're impacting the planet, you're impacting biodiversity, you're impacting people as well, and you shouldn't adopt electric vehicles. Something along those lines. Would you say this is an example of impossible expectations?
So we've deconstructed most of the different climate misinformation arguments, and what we found is that almost every argument, contains more than one fallacy. In the case of the attack on electric vehicles, certainly impossible expectations is one of those fallacies. The other fallacy, I think, is, and this is, now I'm getting jargony, but it's slothful induction, because it's ignoring how much more damaging petrol cars are. They're saying, well, this isn't perfect. Well, it's better than the alternative, which is petrol cars that are pouring all this fossil fuel or all this carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, as well as all the other pollution. So there's a couple of different reasons why that argument is problematic.
And I think it's a really important point, particularly because I think people like me fall for logical fallacies all the time.
Oh, we all do. No, you were right before when you said even experts do. Like, no one's immune.
Yeah, definitely. And it makes it even more difficult and complicated when you're intertwining multiple logical fallacies on top of each other. Because, for whatever reason, I'm reading this logic book at the moment, Introduction to Logic, and even trying to draw a normal logical tree on a relatively easy logic problem, it can be very easy to get tricked into misstepping and thinking illogically. So I think it's important to mention that logic and argumentation, building arguments on top of each other to make a coherent stacking premises on top of each other to make a coherent argument can be really, really tricky.
Slow thinking is hard. Critical thinking is hard. And our brains are hardwired to do fast thinking, easy thinking. So we find it very cognitively effortful to try to logic our way through arguments. It's not easy. And part of my work is on trying to make it easier for people.
Definitely. Okay, well, look, on to the last two letters, C. What does C stand for? What does the first C stand for in the F.L.I.C.C acronym?
So cherry picking is the first C, and cherry picking is looking at just a small part of the puzzle while ignoring the full body of evidence. So it might be something like, hey, there's a glacier growing in New Zealand, global warming is not happening, ignoring that at a global level, the vast majority of glaciers are shrinking.
Yeah, and an example of this I'm thinking of comes from Jordan Peterson. You know, I'm picking on Jordan Peterson a bit today, but I think he deserves to be picked on given some of his stances of climate change. And so, you know, he makes the claim that in one video that he makes the claim that there's more trees have been planted in the past, I don't know, I think 100 years than have been planted ever before. I'll try and find the exact sentence and I'll put it here.
We treat these things so lightly. Well, let's fix the planet. Well, we're going to concentrate on global warming. Well, why global warming? Well, because everyone thinks that's the biggest catastrophe. Well, maybe it is, but if you don't have a solution, well, and then what about all those other problems? What are you going to do about them? Well, we'll ignore them because we can feel good about, you know, being concerned about global warming. It's like, I don't, you know, one of the reasons there's more trees in the Northern Hemisphere than there were 100 years ago. No one knows that, but it's true, and by a substantial margin. You know why, in part? Because people burned coal instead of wood. It's like everyone says, well, we shouldn't burn coal. It's like, okay, fair enough. What do you want to do? Burn trees instead? Because that's what poor people would have done. It's like, coal isn't good. Well, it's better than burning wood. So these things are complicated. So they're unbelievably complicated.
The inference here, or the inference being made, is that despite issues like deforestation and other environmental issues being brought to light to the public, we've actually done a lot of tree planting, and that's going to be good for the environment and carbon sequestration. At least that's what I'm drawing from the claim. But again, I think this is a form of cherry picking. This is an example of it because he's trying to use this data point or data points, trying to construct a whole conclusion from this. But the thing is, if you actually paraphrase the argument and start teasing out the logic, there are hidden premises. So premises he's not actively stating, and hoping that people go along with it, or at least that's what I would argue that he's doing. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, you mentioned like parsing and hidden premises, and that's one of the ways to try to get to the heart of whether an argument is misleading or not. And you really got to do it with people like Jordan Peterson when they make these superficially persuasive arguments. But when you try to break them apart, what are the starting assumptions or premises? What is his conclusion? And are there any hidden assumptions in his argument? You have to do a lot of work to really identify where his argument, if it is misleading or not. And then if he's like talking for an hour and a half and he presents, 100 of these different arguments, it becomes practically really difficult to pull them apart and identify how they're misleading. Which again is why a lot of my work is focused on making it easier for people to spot the misinformation, ideally without having to do all that work every time. And I'll say one more thing. We actually published a paper in 2018, myself and two critical thinking philosophers, where we outlined a method for doing that whole process of pulling apart an argument, identify the premises and the conclusion, identifying any hidden premises, and then trying to check each premise to see whether they're containing fallacies or not. And it was really interesting because my goal as a psychology researcher was to develop a method to identify fallacies, so then I could communicate to people, here's this myth, here's the fallacy it uses. But the critical thinking philosophers, their goal was to develop a method of thinking that the whole world would adopt whenever they encounter an argument, which would be, in an ideal world, yes, that would be wonderful if we all, everything we were looking at, okay, what's the premise, what's the hidden premise, what's the conclusion, is this logically valid or not? But it's just, it's impractical, and it's really not how the human brain is hardwired. Yeah, that's why I think we need to help people as much as we can.
Okay, so, we've just touched on cherry picking, but now we're on the last letter of the acronym. So what is the last C in the F.L.I.C.C acronym technique, taxonomy?
So the last C in F.L.I.C.C is conspiracy theories. And what you find with any science denial is when you have a scientific consensus, when the global community of scientists all agree on something, on some issue, but you disagree with them, then inevitably you start believing conspiracy theories to explain why all the scientists are disagreeing with you. The thing is, though, and that's kind of I guess there's a kind of a warped logic to conspiracy theories in science denial. The problem, though, is once people start going down that rabbit hole of thinking that all the scientific community is conspiring against them, then what we find is if people believe one conspiracy theory, they're more likely to believe other conspiracy theories. So there is a pattern of thought associated with conspiratorial thinking, and they just become distrustful of institutions in general.
Yeah, and just for the purposes of my understanding, can you define a conspiracy? Like a conspiracy theory is used, in common parlance very often, but what actually defines a conspiracy?
A conspiracy theory is the baseless belief that, or the belief that there is a group who are secretly conspiring to deceive the public, usually with some evil intent.
Right, and I think that would make sense why one belief leads to multiple beliefs, because it is grounded on, because belief in something would be grounded on assumptions, and you can't necessarily prove the assumptions. Is that true? Is that the problem with conspiracies fundamentally?
I'd say distrust is probably the driving factor behind that dynamic. For example, if you believe that NASA is capable of faking all their climate data and deceiving the public about the reality of global warming, then you're more likely to believe that NASA faked the moon landing, or organizing chemtrails, or flying drones over New Jersey, or whatever.
Okay, great. So we've now covered all the letters of the acronym now, the F.L.I.C.C acronym, and I'm tempted to put them to the test to try and consolidate our understanding and to brush up on the critical thinking. And so I've prepared a list of statements, and I would like you to let me know what the problem with these statements are. And I encourage anyone listening in the audience, when I'm reading these claims out, feel free to pause and think about the claims yourself and construct an argument in your head as to what is the issue with the claims or the statements that I'm reading. And you can see then how it aligns with John's arguments.
And just so we're following best practices according to the psychology and communication research, we're warning listeners that these statements are misinformation statements, so that people are cognitively on guard and less likely to believe the statements.
Great. Okay. So the first statement, I'll start off with an easy one because we've mentioned it throughout the conversation already. So I think it's a good starting point to dip our toes in the water. So the full statement says this: scientists say 31,000 dissenting scientists prove that there's no expert agreement on human-caused global warming. Now, take a moment to think about that. John, can you help us think through this logical fallacy, or think through this statement? Help us think through this claim.
Right. So firstly, the first part, 31,000 dissenting scientists. So this there's just that phrase scientists is saying someone with a science degree, but in any field of science. So it's not saying climate scientists. It's not 31,000 dissenting climate scientists. It's just 31,000 dissenting scientists. So these are people who can have any expertise in any field of science. So that's the first part of what they're saying. That's kind of the hidden premise, which is the unstated assumption in this argument is if you have a science degree, that makes you an expert in climate change. So that's the first part of it. The second part of it is they're saying there's no expert agreement on human-caused global warming. So when they say experts, an expert on human-caused global warming means a climate expert. So that's the discrepancy. They're talking about scientists in any field having an implication for climate expertise. And so again, there are two main fallacies with this. Repeating that there are often more than one fallacy. The biggest fallacy is fake experts, because just because you have a degree in computer science, that doesn't magically give you expertise in climate change. So that's the main way that this argument is misleading. But the other way that it's misleading is it commits another fallacy, the fallacy of magnified minority. Because 31,000 seemed like a big number. That must be that must mean that a large chunk of the scientific community disagree on climate change. But there are millions and millions of people with science degrees. So 31,000 is actually a fraction of a percent of the scientific community. So they're magnifying this fraction of a percent to make it seem like a big number. And that's another way of misleading the public. So I guess the other hidden premise is that a significant proportion of the scientific community dissent on climate change. That's implied by the emphasis on 31,000, but it's an unstated assumption but it has a misleading effect. And in fact, just to show that this example, this is social misinformation again, it's involving people. There was a study by Sander van der Linden back in 2017, and he did an experiment where he tested like half a dozen different climate myths, and this was the one that was the most persuasive, the 31,000 argument. So it is a potent and persuasive argument.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just say to this statement, when I first read the statement, I was like, what? Like I had to really think about the statement, and even though I was able to identify the fake experts logical fallacy as you did, I still wasn't able to tease out all the other logical or the other strategies in the F.L.I.C.C acronym that you teased out. So I think it goes to show that, again, even for a very short one-sentence claim, it can really twist you into knots. And if you don't take the time to think about it, you can end up believing in claims that are not logically coherent. But anyways, on to the next statement. I believe this is from your app, the Cranky Uncle app, which I encourage everyone to download. It talks about models, climate models specifically. So, these are models that we use to predict how climate changes over time. And I think this is an interesting example. So, this is the second statement. Models can't predict the weather for next week. So how can they predict the climate decades from now? So I think it's a rhetorical question. Anyways, but I'll take your time. Feel free to take your time, and I'll repeat it again. Models can't predict the weather for next week. So how can they predict the climate decades from now? So, John, help us think through this example.
Right. So, again, it's an argument that commits multiple fallacies. And even though it's framed like a rhetorical question, really what it is saying is models can't predict the weather next week, therefore models can't predict climate decades from now. So that's really the conclusion. Firstly, this is the lesser fallacy, but weather models are getting better and better at predicting the weather. Like, they do a pretty good job at the moment. So I would argue that they are actually pretty good at predicting the weather. So that there's a bit of impossible expectations there. Like, if they're not absolutely perfect, then they're useless. If we don't know everything, we know nothing. That fallacy. And also, so it's a bit of impossible expectations, and it's a bit of misrepresentation, because I think that they do quite well. But the main fallacy in this argument is false equivalence. It's saying that weather and climate are the same thing, when weather and climate are two different things. Climate is actually weather averaged over time and space. It's the difference between predicting a single coin toss and predicting 1,000 coin tosses. If you just do one single coin toss, it's going to be either heads or tails. It's 50-50. But if you do 1,000 coin tosses, if you predict, I think it'll be about 500 heads and 500 tails, you're going to be roughly right. It's the average, so it averages out, and you'll be pretty close to being correct. So climate is just taking all the chaos and unpredictability of weather, although, as I said, it's getting better to predict it, and averaging it out. We know that summer is warmer than winter because it's on average. While we don't know what the weather was going to be like on June the 12th versus December the 12th, on average we know that December is going to be warmer than June. For Southern Hemisphere listeners, I don't know about whether you get much listeners in the Northern Hemisphere.
Okay, well, I think that's covered. And I think I'll touch on just one more example. And I think I'll do another Jordan Peterson statement. I think it seems to be a theme going on this podcast, but may as well just lean into it. But look, okay, so this statement is a statement that he's made on an episode of the Joe Rogan podcast, and I'll try and find the episode number so you can fact check that I'm pulling from the actual source.
The climate change one is a weird one. So
that's because there's no such thing as climate, right? Climate and everything are the same word. And that's what bothers me about the climate change types. It's like, this is something that bothers me about it technically. It's like, well, climate is about everything. So, okay, but your models aren't based on everything. Your models are based on a set number of variables.
Yeah.
So that means you've reduced the variables, which are everything, to that set. Well, how did you decide which set of variables to include in the equation if it's about everything? And that's not just a criticism. That's like, if it's about everything, your models aren't right.
Yeah. So I'm struggling because it's an almost nonsensical statement. Ideally, when you debunk something, you first want to deconstruct it to work out what are the premises and what is the conclusion, and you don't want to debunk a straw man or a weakened version of the argument. The version you want to debunk is the strongest possible version of it. So I'm struggling to see what is he actually arguing here.
Yeah. So I'll try and I think this is a good example of something that we've both haven't thought through as much, and so it's an authentic deconstruction of an argument.
It sounds kind of like, I can say this because it's a term in the academic literature. It sounds like pseudo-profound bullshit. So it sounds like
an official academic term.
Yeah. So it something that sounds like it means something, but it actually means nothing.
Yeah. And I think I don't know all the logical fallacies at hand, but climate change is a distinct definition in the scientific literature, and so this would be pulling from a more fact-based argument. So climate and everything are by definition not the same thing on the basis of this fact-based argument. Climate is the average temperature patterns over long periods of time. Everything, I don't know what he's trying to say by that. And so from my perspective, it is just a patently false claim to say that.
He seems to be saying we do not have the capacity to understand our climate. So in other words, just climate science is a futile exercise. So yeah, I guess it's I guess it's a mix of ad hominem attack on climate science and a mix of slothful induction, in that it's ignoring all the evidence that climate science has collected on which helps us understand our climate system.
And just touching on the discussion that we had before about how there can be multiple fallacies in a certain claim, I think a slight nuance to add to this is that there can be different types of techniques that are used within the argument. So, for example, there can be an ad hominem attack, but there can also be a fact-based claim that is being made that is not true. And so in this case, you have a blend of a technique-based disinformation and fact-based disinformation. And I think this adds a lot of... It makes the challenge of deconstructing misinformation all the more challenging as well.
And this brings us back to that challenge, because someone can just make a sentence-long statement like this, and then we twist ourselves into knots trying to figure out, well, what does it actually mean and how is it misleading? I mean, I think that if you did look at the context and everything he says, maybe you can kind of get a clear idea of what he means. Yeah. But I think the general principle of my work is having experts deconstruct climate misinformation arguments and then communicate the fallacies and explain the fallacies to people. Because every other example you've given are climate myths that we've been hearing for the last 3 decades. We're very familiar with them. We've debunked them many times for many years. So we know, that myth, well, that myth commits that fallacy. So you can provide people the explanations. Here are the main fallacies you're going to hear. The F.L.I.C.C taxonomy, and arm people with the most common examples that they're most likely to see, and they can ideally spot them quickly and be more immune to being misled.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's worth plugging here your website, which is called Skeptical Science, and you have a very large collection of information about all the scientific evidence on the strategies of counteracting misinformation and disinformation, and techniques and all sorts of tools to equip people. And so I recommend everyone go look at your website. But I think this is a good place to wrap up. And so I would like to ask one of the final questions. What are a few takeaways or a few things that you hope people take with them after this conversation, or in general with regards to countering misinformation, or even your research in general? What is something you hope they take away?
The same techniques of misinformation used in climate misinformation are found in every topic. So I'd say the main takeaway is learning the techniques of misinformation is like a universal vaccine against misinformation. If you can spot it in one topic, you can spot it in other topics. So that's quite a powerful way to arm yourself against misinformation and push back against misinformation so that you can help inoculate all your friends and family as well.
No, definitely. And I hope this I hope this helps people improve their critical thinking skills, and it certainly has for me. And hopefully, people will be able to have more amicable family dinners and parties, and have all sorts of things that can help reduce the tensions with regards to claims on science, with regards to claims of climate change, or any sort of claim, really. Because the things that we've learned today can be applied in all domains, and I think helping people to think better, to think more critically, is the best possible outcome. And so I think it'd be a great place to wrap up, is that if people want to find your research or find your work, where can they find you? Please feel free to mention anything.
So there's skepticalscience.com, which is where we debunk climate myths. Skeptical spelled with a K, the American spelling. And that website really takes the fact-based approach. It explains the facts of climate change and debunks all the different climate myths. But the other place you can go to is crankyuncle.com, which is where we take the technique-based approach. Cranky Uncle is a smartphone game. You can play it in a browser as well, and it teaches you the fallacies in F.L.I.C., or the techniques in F.L.I.C. So it's one way of inoculating the public against the techniques in misinformation.
Fantastic, and I'll link the academic papers that we mentioned in this podcast in the description. So anyone interested in the science or interested in making sure that this is accurate can look for themselves. But look, that's everything for this podcast. Thank you very much for joining me, John, and thank you for coming on.
Great to talk to you. Thanks.